Father, we thank you for this time together that we can spend in the study of your word. And we just pray that you would be with us as we look at some of the past and some of the things that have happened. And Father, I just pray that you help me to remember what I've prepared, that you help me not to say anything that is not true and that is not pleasing to you. And just pray that you would help us to come away with a better understanding of the history of your people and how we have achieved to the place where we are today. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So, I know some people weren't here and some were, but we were looking, we got about halfway through Daniel chapter 11, and we were looking at, so chapter 10, 11, and 12 is the final vision that Daniel has. The final prophecy, and we were looking at each individual verse and then looking at the historical event that history has recorded that tells us that that prophecy came true. And if you remember, one of the things we had been talking about were the kings of the north, the kings of the south. And to remind you, the kings of the north were the Seleucid Empire, and most of the rulers were either Seleucus, the first, second, third, fourth, or Antiochus, first, second, third, fourth. Most of them acquired that name when they became king, either Seleucus or Antiochus. All the kings of the south, that was the Ptolemy kingdom, they acquired the name Ptolemy, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So if you remember, we looked at some of the verses that said the king of the south would send his daughter to marry the king of the north. And then we looked that history told us Ptolemy II sent his daughter Bernice to marry Antiochus II in order to secure a peace treaty. And then it said how she would be betrayed, and we saw how Antiochus' wife ended up having Bernice killed, also killing her son that was Antiochus' heir. That way, none of the Ptolemy line ever had access to the throne. So we got to this part, and if you remember, one of the things that happened in one of the battles between the north and the south is Antiochus III, king of the north, had been defeated by the Romans. And the Romans forced him to give them 20 select hostages. And one of the hostages was his son, Antiochus IV, who was shipped off to Rome, where he was brought up as a Roman. He was not the oldest son, so he was not the one that was going to take the throne. Seleucus III was the oldest son, and that's kind of where we left off. So Seleucus had been had died, and instead of his son Seleucus IV taking the throne, Antiochus IV takes the throne. And that's where we are in chapter 11, verse 21. Verse 21 says, "He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty." So, if you know anything or remember anything about Antiochus IV, he was horrible to the Jews. He was known for persecuting them, killing them, selling them into slavery. He was a contemptible person to the Jews. And since he was not Seleucus III's son, he wasn't to inherit the throne. So it says he was not given the honor of royalty. And it says that he will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. So Antiochus IV had been sent to Rome, brought up as a Roman, and by flattery, he was able to get some of the kings of Asia to support him in taking the throne from Seleucus IV. So through flattery, he was able to take the throne. And then verse 22 says, "Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and the prince of the covenant will be destroyed. Antiochus IV of the Seleucid Empire, he defeated Ptolemy VI's forces during the Sixth Syrian War, which happened around 170 BC. He conquered much of Egypt. He captured Ptolemy VI and made him a puppet king. So in reality, Antiochus IV now has control of the Ptolemy Empire over Egypt, and he's allowing Ptolemy the Sixth to remain king, but he's a puppet king. He has to do what Antiochus IV tells him. And if we look, it says, both, in verse 22, besides that, it says, both it and the prince of the covenant will be destroyed. So who's the prince of the covenant? What's the covenant? Or who are the covenant people? Yeah, the Jews, the Israelites. So the prince of the covenant, it is thought, was Onias III, who was the head high priest at the time, the high priest of the Jewish temple at the time. Under Antiochus IV's reign, he had Onias III deposed, and then later had him murdered, because Onias was against the Hellenization of the Jewish people. So Antiochus wants the Jews to give up their Jewish ways and become Greek. Onias says, no, we're not going to do that. And so Antiochus IV has him removed from office and later has him killed because he still has too much influence over the Jewish people. And that was in 175 BC when he was deposed and murdered. So verse 23 says, after coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. So Antiochus IV made a lot of alliances. History tells us he made a lot of alliances with the other kingdoms around him, and he was incredibly deceitful in how he did it. He became very powerful through these alliances. And at this particular time, when Antiochus IV takes over, he says he will do it with only a few people. He'll rise to power. The Seleucid Empire was not very powerful at that time. There weren't a lot of people. There weren't very many subjects. They had gone through a lot of wars. They had lost a lot of people. So there weren't a lot of people in the Seleucid Empire anymore. So he's achieving this just as the Bible said he would, through intrigue, through treaties that he betrays, and with few people, he's taking power and acquiring position of power. Verse 24 goes on and says, when the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. So due to all these alliances that he's made, all these surrounding kingdoms think, we have an alliance, we're safe. And they're pretty wealthy empires that are around him, and history tells us that repeatedly he would invade those kingdoms that he had alliances with and hit those outlying cities and plunder their riches and take them back. So he's doing exactly what the vision Daniel said he would do. As verse 25 says, with a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. So king of the south, that's the Ptolemy Empire. And Antiochus Epiphanes, again, wages war against Ptolemy VI. Ptolemy VI is defeated in large part because many of his army commanders deserted and left him because they had made deals with Antiochus IV on the side. Verse 26 says, those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. So Ptolemy VI's counselors tell him, you know what, you really need to reclaim Palestine. Antiochus IV has taken it. His counselors are encouraging him to wage war against Antiochus IV and reclaim Palestine. And when he does this, he ends up igniting the wrath of Antiochus IV, who is now starting to become a pretty powerful empire. And Antiochus IV then goes out and he totally wipes out Ptolemy VI. And verse 27 says, the two kings with their hearts bent on evil will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. In a little bit, we're going to talk about how the Ptolemy Empire and the Seleucid Empire actually ended. Their time of the end did come. You know, it's not happening right yet, but it does come in a few years. And neither of these kingdoms ever really amounted to much. They fought amongst themselves, the north and the south, all the time, but they never really acquired major power. Nothing like Alexander the Great had done when he conquered the world. Nothing like Nebuchadnezzar had done when the Babylonian Empire reached its peak. Nothing like the Persian army had done when they conquered the Babylonians. So neither of these two kingdoms, if you remember the prophecy, it said that Alexander the Great's kingdom would be split into 4 weaker kingdoms. And they're weak kingdoms, and 2 of them are just constantly fighting, the north and the south, against each other. So, verse 28, the king of the north, that's Antiochus IV, the king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. So Antiochus IV goes back to his own country. He's plundered a lot of Ptolemy's kingdom, taken a lot of wealth with him, and when he gets back, he decides he is done with the Jews and he is going to persecute them to his full extent. And that's exactly what happens. When he gets back to his kingdom, he really sets out to destroy the Jewish people. Verse 29 says, at the appointed time, he will invade the south again. But this time, the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastland will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So Antiochus IV tries once again to invade Egypt. He's sick of the Ptolemies too. He's going to fight with them. As he begins to conquer Egypt, what lies to the west? The ships of the coastline. The Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire lands on the coast, and they stop Antiochus IV's progression into Egypt, and they basically tell him, leave, or we're going to destroy you. And so he leaves, and he is mad because he wanted to wipe out the Ptolemies. The Romans won't let him. They turn him around, they send him back, and he is angry, and when he gets back, he's looking for someone to take his anger out on. And it's the Holy Covenant, the Jewish people. So, in 167 BC, Antiochus makes all Jewish practices, circumcision, possessing scriptures, sacrifices, feast days, it is against the law. He outlaws it, and if you break the law, punishable by death. So, he's done with it. He builds an altar to Zeus in the Jerusalem temple, and he begins to sacrifice pigs on the altar. So, it says in verse 31, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortresses and will abolish the daily sacrifice. So he's not allowing the Jews to have their daily sacrifice anymore. And he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. To the Jewish people, building an altar to Zeus in their temple and sacrificing pigs, that is an abomination to them. And it has completely desecrated their temple. It says, with flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Now, there is not a specific historical event that says that at this time some Jews forsook their Jewish practices and through flattery, they supported him. But we know through reading through the Bible, there were many times throughout Jewish history where they turned their back on God. They walked away from their Jewish practices. They walked away from the law. So we know that that has happened, so it's not impossible to think that, yeah, it probably happened here as well. But of the Jews that remain, some of them are going to turn back to God, and they're going to remain strong. We know from other Bible passages, the remnant of a remnant. There's always a remnant that will not bow down, that will not break the laws, and always is there to reestablish things. Verse 33 tells us, those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. Now, in the second book of Maccabees, there's a story. It's told where Antiochus IV, during his persecution and his attempt to Hellenize the Jews, he demands that Eleazar, this is not Eleazar the high priest that was one of Aaron's sons. This is a different Eleazar who was a Jewish scribe. He demands that Eleazar eats pork. That is against the Jewish law. He even tells Eleazar, look, you don't really have to eat the pork. We're just going to say you did. And Eleazar says, no, I will not do that. He was concerned that his action, or even admitting that, even if it wasn't true, would mislead the Jewish youth that were coming up behind him. So he refused to do it, so Antiochus IV has him killed. So we have a teacher of the law who's being killed, just as verse 33 tells us. History tells us that under Antiochus IV, tens of thousands of Jews were killed and sold into slavery. Maybe 80,000 Jews were killed or sold into slavery. So Antiochus IV was not a good guy. He was a horrible persecutor of the Jews. Verse 34 tells us that when they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Only a small number of the Jews have refused to basically be made Greek. They're remaining faithful to the Jewish law, and so whenever those who are there are persecuted, there's not many left to help them up. There's not many to hide them, not many to encourage them. But some of the Jews during this time, they see how those who are resisting are staying true to their religion, to their God, and to the law. So they begin to join the cause. They're not really sincere in it, as it says in verse 34, but they're beginning to join the cause because they see some of their fellow Jews are standing up to them. Now, verse 35, some of these wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. For it will still come at the appointed time. So he's saying, those who are going to remain faithful during this time, you're going to face difficulties, but you're going to be stronger for it after it's over, after the appointed time, the persecution is done. Now, the real question here is, what is this, when he talks about end times, he says, spotless until the time of the end. What's he talking about? What do you think he's talking about? A lot of people don't like to talk about the term end times, not because it's the end of all things, but what end of time is he talking about? This is where some people will say, okay, up till verse 35, yeah, that prophecy's been fulfilled. We saw the Persians, we saw the Greeks, we've seen the kingdoms of the north and the south. We've got history that proves it all. We know the Romans have come in. And then a lot of scholars will tell you, okay, right there it ends. Now we're going to jump to the end of times and the second coming of Christ. Why? What in this verse tells us, okay, we're done with that, now let's move forward a couple thousand years? There's nothing that tells us that we're not still continuing along with some of the same stuff. Remember, back last week we talked about the angel that is explaining to Daniel what's going on. He says, this is a prophecy for your people. Your people. Who are Daniel's people? They're the Jews. All of the Jews. And he's telling them, this is a prophecy for your people, not This is a prophecy for your people, and then later everybody else in the world. He's saying this is a prophecy for your people. Now, premillennialists who want to do the literal 1,000-year reign, trials and tribulation, and the second coming and all of that, they'll say, okay, right here, that's what they're talking about. And they'll use these verses and the rest of the verses to tell you that premillennialism and 1,000-year reign and everything is what they're talking about. But I'm going to show you that it's not. They're still talking about the Roman Empire and what's happening with the Roman Empire. So there is nothing in this text that suggests, we've been going along in chronological order. You know, we started with the defeat of the Babylonians defeating the Persians back around 553 BC. Then we moved up a little bit to around 300 BC, then the 200 BC, 100. And we've just been moving steadily forward. And there's nothing here that indicates that we should now jump a couple thousand years ahead or more. So the prophecy reminds that this may be the end of the Jewish system. This is, you know, if you don't know, Israel that's there today has not always been there. The kingdom of Israel was pretty much destroyed in around 135 BC. And until it was brought back after World War II, there was no kingdom of Israel or Israel. So the end of the Israelites is coming. Or at least the end of their system. It's not the end of the Jewish people, but the end of their system, their temple, their daily sacrifices. Now, we know another reason that it also came to end, because the anointed one came, the Messiah came, and he, you know, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. You know, Jesus even told the woman in the well in John 4:21 and following, he says, "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and truth." He's telling the woman at the well, look, everything's about to change. Everything as you know it, even as the Jews know it, it's all about to change. Now, he is also referring to he, the Messiah, that has come, but there's more to come after that. The angel who's been describing this, you know, he's continuing his explanation on things that will happen to the Jewish people. If you remember when we talked last week, Daniel chapter 10, verse 14, he says, "Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come." But there's a significant historical evidence that suggests the remaining verses are not about the end of times, but the Roman Empire destroying Jerusalem and destroying the temple. You know, when that happened in 70 AD, and then the final destruction, the Roman Emperor Hadrian in 135 AD, he finally pretty much destroyed all of the city of Jerusalem, outlawed the Jews from being allowed to be in that area. He outlawed all Jewish practices, and the majority of Jews that hadn't already dispersed after 70 AD pretty much dispersed all over the world after 135. Because after 135, there is no more Jerusalem. The city is gone, and all the people have scattered. In verse 36, we hear again about a new king. So it says, "The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is complete. For what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors, or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses. A god unknown to his ancestors he will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortress with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. Now, who is the new king they're talking about? There's 4 different views on who that could be. One of them is people think it's the Antichrist. So we talked a little bit about that. If we go to end times, they talk about the Antichrist. We'll talk about that in a minute. One view is that we're still talking about Antiochus IV. A third view is that maybe they're referring to Herod the Great. And then the fourth view is that it is one of the Roman emperors. So we're going to look at each one of these, but we need to jump back to some of these other verses. 40 through 45, and this is the end of chapter 11. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. We talked before, the beautiful land, that's Palestine, that's Jerusalem. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hands. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold, of silver, and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and the Cushites. And the Cushites are the Ethiopians also. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the sea, the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Now, 4 reasons why this cannot be Antiochus IV. In verse 40, the king of the south moves against this king. However, we know that the king of the south never moved against Antiochus IV. He never went out and attacked Antiochus IV. So that's one reason that this new king can't be Antiochus IV. Second, Antiochus IV never fought a war against Egypt successfully. After the events we previously talked about in verses 21 through 35. So he didn't pursue another victory over Egypt. He wasn't able to accomplish it because the Romans drove him out. The third reason is Antiochus never conquered the nations listed here. He never conquered Ethiopia or Egypt or the Cushites or the Libyans. So we know that for the third reason, that can't be Antiochus IV. And then the fourth reason is he never gained control of all of these riches. So we know that this new king, based on historical events, cannot be Antiochus IV. So what about Herod the Great? There's 2 reasons why it can't be Herod the Great. For one, Egypt never came against Herod the Great. So we're not talking about Herod the Great. And second, Herod never conquered, never attacked Egypt, and he never conquered Egypt, Libya, or Ethiopia. So we know they're not talking about Herod the Great. Now, we talked a little bit about the Antichrist already. A future Antichrist doesn't fit into the chronology of events. We've been reading about so far that we've been going a few years at a time through all this prophecy, and now we're supposed to suddenly jump to some unknown time in the future, and that just doesn't make sense as to why it would be that. And we remember from Daniel 10:14, the angel says, I'm going to tell you about a prophecy about your people. And all the other people in the world are not Daniel's people. So the Antichrist just doesn't really fit here. These verses are most likely referring to some Roman emperor. We don't know which one, but one of the Roman emperors. And it fits the chronology. Because we've been Antiochus IV, he's having trouble with the Romans already, and we know later from history that the Romans do totally wipe out the Seleucid Empire. So it fits with that close chronology that we've been going year by year by year as we look through this. During the latter days, it was the Roman Empire. Around the time that this is happening, they are the world power. They are the superpower. Nobody can stand against the Romans at that time. And verse 36 easily fits the description up here. King that does as he pleases It easily fits the description of an emperor who defines himself as better than God and he blasphemes God. I mean, every Roman emperor out there pretty much did that. They thought of themselves as God and they blasphemed the one true God. And then verses 36 through 39, if you read that description, it sounds very familiar to the description given of the Roman Empire in Revelations 13. Now, finally, it was the Roman armies that surrounded Jerusalem and destroyed it, just as this vision has depicted. You know, he's talking about the destruction. He's talking about, you know, we'll look a little bit more later about what Jesus said about it, but he's talking about the end of the Jewish system. And Daniel, that angel is describing to Daniel, look, these things are going to happen and they have to happen. And I'm giving you a warning, and if people will listen to you, then some of them might be saved. So verse 39 that I've highlighted here, he will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. That is a clear description of the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire would conquer a nation, if the king of that conquered nation was willing to submit to Rome, if they were willing to keep down nationalism and willing to collect and pay their taxes on time, then the Roman emperor would allow them to keep ruling over their kingdom as a puppet ruler. That was very common in the Roman Empire. So that description there in 39 fits very well with what the Roman Empire would do, which is more evidence to say that this is not talking about thousands of years from now. This is talking about the Roman Empire, which is happening at this time. In verse 40, we read that the king of the south, which was the Ptolemies, going against the Romans, Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemy line. She was aided by Mark Antony, and she begins to push against Rome. This leads to Rome declaring war against Egypt under the leadership of Octavian at the time. He was emperor. Octavian would later become Augustus Caesar. The Ptolemies were put to the end as Rome conquered and won the battle of Actium. As the Romans began their conquest, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, in verse 41, they were able to escape. They were not conquered. The Romans also took control of Egypt and the surrounding nations as they continued their conquest. Verse 42, he extends his power over many countries. Therefore, the Romans controlled most of the known world at this time. The Romans placed some heavy taxes on the nations in order to increase their wealth. Some of those nations would rise up against Rome because they're protesting the taxes and their treatment. But it was useless. The Romans had great power, and they would go in and wipe them out, annihilate them. So Rome would exercise its power over the Jewish nation, and we're told that an end was appointed for the Roman Empire. It hasn't been seen yet at this time, but he says, look, it's not going to last forever. The angel is telling Daniel there's going to be an end to it. We know that the Seleucid Empire, the kingdom of the north, was ultimately defeated by Rome in 68 BC. And the Ptolemy, the southern empire, was defeated in 30 BC. And so, verse 42 tells us Egypt will not escape. Egypt was the capital of the Ptolemaic Empire at the time. Now, we're finally going to make it to chapter 12. We've got 25 minutes. So, chapter 12 has a lot of stuff in it. And if you're hoping that I'm going to interpret some of that, like the 1,290 days and the 1,335 days, I'm not. Because we've been looking at historical events. I'd be happy to answer questions about it, what I've read about it. But, I'm not going to try. There's some things we just don't know yet. We don't understand them. We may never until the end of time. We may learn about them eventually over time. But chapter 12 is just a continuation of 11. You know, the vision Daniel's having starts in chapter 10. We get most of the vision in chapter 11, and then we finish up with it in chapter 12. And it tells us the final end of this vision, and we'll see how Daniel reacts to the information that is given. You know, chapter 12 starts out with, at that time. So again, we ask, what time? What time is he talking about? He's, you know, based on what I have read and what I've been seeing, these verses tell me that at that time was when the Roman Empire is conquering everybody else. When the Roman Empire is conquering the Bible lands, and when it's ultimately going to destroy the temple in Jerusalem. So, you know, verse 1 says, at that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, there it is again, will rise. And then this next part is pretty important. It says, there will be a time of distress, such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. It says, but at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Okay, therefore, since the angel has been speaking in chronological fashion for Daniel, at that time, to me, says that he must be talking about at that time that the Roman Empire is conquering. You know, what does it mean about Michael, the prince, stands up to protect your people? You know, the Jews don't know at that time, but if you read on, you know, they know that a terrible, horrible thing is about to happen. And Michael is going to be there. He's not going to prevent it, because we know already, he said, these things must happen. He's not going to prevent it, but he's going to be there. He's going to be there to protect those that remain faithful. So, the event is going to be significant, since the angel says that it would be a time of distress that had never been seen before by a nation. Jesus uses the same language in Matthew 24, 15 through 21. In verse 15, starting in 15, it says, Jesus speaking says, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand then, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on their housetop go down and take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now. So in Daniel it says there's going to be a great thing happening from since nations began until then. Jesus is saying from when nations began until now. And he's talking about the same passage that Daniel has just referred, that we just looked at in Daniel. So, and then he says that it will never be equaled again. So this thing that's going to happen in Daniel, Jesus is saying from then until now, it's about to happen. And it's never going to happen again. So, whatever Jesus was talking about is the same thing that the angel is revealing to Daniel. You know, Jesus living in the later days of the Jewish nation during the days of the Roman Empire, he spoke about the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24, 1 through 2 sets the context that Jesus is describing that the signs that not one stone will be left overturned, stacked on top of the other. It's going to all be destroyed. In Luke 21, a parallel passage, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and we know that the Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple. You know, so Daniel is warning the Jewish people, this bad thing is going to come. And then Jesus is telling them, look, when you see the abomination in the temple, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, you better flee to the mountains. And we'll look at a little bit of history about that in just a few minutes. But At that time, your people, everyone who is written in the book, will be rescued. There is a group of people, this event is coming, your people, the Jews, which Daniel is a Jew. So the Jews that listen to the warning that Daniel is writing down would be rescued. More clearly, those who would listen to the words of Jesus concerning the destruction and following the directions that Jesus gives in Luke 21, 20 through 24, and in Matthew 24, 21 through 28, are going to be rescued from this. He's saying, when you see this happening, you better flee for the mountains. And we know from Josephus, one of the Jewish historians, he recorded that those who did not escape quickly were shut up inside of Jerusalem when the Romans surrounded. And it's estimated that 1 million Jews were killed in Jerusalem during that time because they did not flee and escape. Some of them did. So it cannot be a second coming that's being prophesied about, because if you look in verse 2, it says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. Now, is multitudes everyone? Some versions say many. At the end of times, how many people are going to rise from the grave? Anyone? Everybody. And they're all going to be judged. But here he's saying many of them. And what he's referring to is that many of them are going to have a spiritual resurrection. Many of them are going to see the error of their ways, how they've turned against God. They're going to rededicate themselves to worship of God the proper way. And we see that also in Malachi 3:13, when in Malachi it's called the Book of Remembrance. And he's talking about there that those who are in that book are going to have a spiritual awakening or a spiritual renewal and be restored as the Jewish people. Daniel is telling them basically the same thing. Those who are written in the book are going to have a spiritual resurrection. These are the people that are probably going to follow the Messiah and be the true Jerusalem. So, a multitude is not many, and we know that John 5:28 through 29 says, "Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in the grave will hear his voice and come out, and those who have done what is good will rise to life, those who have done what is evil will rise to condemn." So it's a different kind of resurrection that we're talking about in Daniel verse 2 versus the end of times. So verse 3 tells us that those who would understand these things would find a life through deliverance from the Messiah. The wise will have insight, understanding these things, recognizing the Messiah, and finding life. To survive the times that were coming would require understanding and insight. They need to know the prophecies that Daniel has laid out and recognize the signs that are coming. We've already talked about that. Now, Daniel is hearing all of this stuff. Does he understand it all? No. We don't understand all of it. And, we've had a lot of history to help back it up. We understand a lot of it now from history, but we still don't understand all of it. Daniel in verse 8 says, "I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be?" If Daniel wants to know what the outcome of these events, but the information he's told, seal it up. Roll up the scrolls and seal it up. Verse 9, and earlier in verse 4, but also in verse 9, the angel tells Daniel, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the end of times." Remember that statement. They're rolled up and sealed until the end of times. So, the angel is telling Daniel, look, don't worry. Your life is nearly over. You've lived a long life. You are about to rest. You don't need to worry about this. It's not going to happen in your lifetime. It's going to come later. So he's telling him, go your way, Daniel. You can rest and relax. It's going to be fine. Verse 10 says, many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. Verse 10 is telling us these events they have to happen. They're set to purify the people. Because of the destruction of the temple and the end of the Jewish system, many of these Jews they're going to be purified. They're going to be renewed. They're going to be, returned to God, turning back their lives to God. But many of the wicked are going to keep doing the same thing they've always done. They've already turned their back on God, and maybe life has been good for them, so they're just going to keep doing what they do. Earlier in chapter 10, verse 14, again, he talks about, I've come to explain what's going to happen to your people in the future. But in verse 4 and verse 9, Daniel is told, roll up the scrolls and seal it, until the end of times. In Revelations 22:10, when John is seeing visions, he is told, it says, then he told me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this scroll because the time is near. Some of the Revelation prophecy is referring to the destruction of the temple. And that has already happened at the writing of Revelation. Now, there's some that think that Revelation was written right before the destruction of the temple, but the majority of people believe it was written probably about 25 years after the destruction of the temple. When John was getting probably about 5 years before he died. So, the destruction of the temple was the start of it. But when Hadrian razed the city, and then he ordered the construction of a new city called Aelia Capitolonia on top of Jerusalem, and that's when he outlawed Jewish practices. He outlawed the Jews being in the vicinity, that all the Jews now in 135 have dispersed. They're gone. Basically now Jerusalem is no more. So the time of the Jewish system is over. So as John is writing this, it's only about 40 years until the end of the Jewish system. So when he sees his revelation, when he sees his prophecy, he's revealing it. And we know that it wasn't too much longer. And he's told, don't seal these up because the time is near. And 40 years is a lot nearer than when Daniel saw it, roughly 600, 700 years earlier. And Daniel was told to seal it up because the time is not yet come. So, that's about all I have. But like I say, if you have questions about the 1290 days, the 1335, I read quite a few things. I will do my best, but it's very open to interpretation by a lot of different people. I think some of the stuff I read, I think makes a lot of sense, and I kind of tend to follow that direction. But that's all I have for Daniel and science and archaeology and geology and history and all the stuff we've talked about. Does anybody have any questions? You're all confused, right? I've enjoyed doing this. I hope to do some more at some point in the future, but I don't know what it will be about. So I need time to research some things and figure some things out. But say we have about 10 minutes till the bell, so I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. Yes?
I was taught that 1209 days would be symbolic time of intense persecution, following the time of Antiochus Epiphanes when he desecrated the temple.
There is no historical events that line up perfectly with 1290 days. Some of the thoughts I read about it, the time and a half time,
Right.
3.5 years, 1290 days is about 3.5 years. And most of what I read said that the 1290 is not a set specific amount of time. It is just it just means a period of time. And that if you can outlast it, 1335 is a little bit more than 1290 if you're going to make it through to the end. And that's most of what I read from it, is that it is, because it does talk about time, and a half time, and from the time of, I forget which emperor it was, but from the time that one of the emperors first conquered Jerusalem until the final destruction of the temple, I think was about 3.5 years. You know, and it fits pretty close with that 1290. A lot of Revelation says 1260. I did read one thing that said that the Jewish calendar, every 3 years, they would have about 30 days to get back onto a solar calendar. And if you had 30 days of 1260, you get 1290, and then maybe that's why Daniel says 1290 and the Revelation says 1260, but I don't know how accurate any of that is, but there's not any historical events that will perfectly line up with 1290 days or 1335 days.
I don't think they follow the time that's exact like we do.
Right.
I think it's more of a symbolic, intense, right?
I do too, and I think it's just basically saying that, look, for a while that's going to be longer than 3 years and maybe shorter than 4. You know, or just it's going to be a set amount of time, given, 3 to 4 years or somewhere in there. But there are no historical events that perfectly line up with those dates. So that's and most people agree that it's not a exact time, it's more of a specific time period. Any other questions? No? I guess we get out a little early and can visit for a while. So I've enjoyed doing this. I appreciate everybody being here and listening, and hope I didn't go too fast and too much information or anything. So there are some wonderful, great outlets out there to be able to find this information. And I only hit the tip of the iceberg for what's out there. So I tried to condense it. Like I said, I did in 4 weeks what somebody did in, I think, 13 weeks on Daniel. So I just hit the tip of it.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and that's all I've got.